Beirut, Lebanon, January 23, 1963. Harold Adrian Russell Philby stood on the deck of the Soviet freighter Dolmatova, watching the lights of Beirut fade into the Mediterranean darkness. The 51-year-old journalist, former MI6 officer, former head of anti-Soviet counterintelligence, former liaison to the CIA, had just walked away from a dinner party at the British Embassy and vanished into the night. His wife Eleanor had no idea where he'd gone. Neither did Nicholas Elliott, his old friend from MI6, who had flown to Beirut specifically to extract a confession. What they didn't know was that Philby had been a Soviet agent for 30 years. For 3 decades, a man with a prominent stutter and an old Etonian accent had sat at the very heart of British intelligence, reading every secret, attending every meeting, privy to every operation against Moscow. He had seen the Venona decrypts that exposed other Soviet spies. He had run the department hunting Soviet agents in Britain. He had been groomed for the top job, Chief of MI6 itself. And through it all, he had been feeding everything to Moscow's center. The betrayal wasn't just operational. It was personal, institutional, civilizational. Philby had gone to the right schools, knew the right people, spoke with the right accent. He was one of them. That's exactly what made him so dangerous, and why it took so long for anyone to believe the truth. As the ship steamed toward the Soviet Union, dozens of British and American agents he had betrayed were already dead, and Western intelligence operations across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. The question wasn't how Kim Philby had fooled British intelligence. The question was why it had been so easy. In June 1934, a 22-year-old Cambridge graduate named Kim Philby sat in Regent's Park, London, with Arnold Deutsch, an Austrian communist recruiter for Soviet intelligence. Philby had just returned from Vienna, where he'd witnessed the Austrian government's suppression of a socialist uprising, and married a communist militant named Litzy Friedman. He was young, idealistic, and convinced that only the Soviet Union stood against the rising tide of fascism. When Deutsch asked if he would work for the cause, Philby didn't hesitate. As he later wrote in his memoir, "I left the university with a degree and with the conviction that my life must be devoted to communism." But Deutsch had something more specific in mind than street-level activism. He wanted Philby to abandon his overt communist sympathies, reinvent himself as a conventional young gentleman, and burrow deep into the British establishment. "You must become," Deutsch told him, "a bourgeois." It was a brilliant strategy that exploited a fundamental weakness in British society: class. British intelligence in the 1930s and 1940s recruited almost exclusively from Oxford and Cambridge, from public schools like Eton and Westminster, from families with the right connections. Security vetting was minimal because gentlemen didn't spy, or so the assumption went. As MI5 officer Peter Wright later observed, it was an old boy network where the tie you wore mattered more than what was in your files. Philby executed his transformation flawlessly. He covered for the Times during the Spanish Civil War, carefully positioned on the nationalist side despite his communist sympathies. He cultivated relationships with establishment figures. He drank at the right clubs and spoke the right way. When Guy Burgess, another Soviet agent from the Cambridge ring, recommended Philby to MI6 in 1940, his credentials seemed impeccable: public school education, family connections. His father was the noted Arabist St. John Philby, journalism experience, and anti-communist credentials from Spain. The vetting process was perfunctory. As one MI6 officer later admitted, "We knew his father, and that was basically enough." Philby was hired to work in Section D, MI6's sabotage and propaganda unit. Within months, Britain's newest intelligence officer was photographing documents for the NKVD. The Soviet intelligence apparatus knew they had found something extraordinary. Philby's handler reported to Moscow, "This is a man who could rise to the highest positions in British intelligence. We must protect him at all costs." The instruction was clear. Philby should not be used for tactical intelligence gathering that might expose him. He was being groomed for strategic penetration at the very top. And everyone, his superiors, his colleagues, his friends, believed in him completely. "Kim was one of us," Nicholas Elliott later said. "He went to Westminster. He knew how we thought, how we operated. It never occurred to anyone that he might be working against us. It was unthinkable." That fundamental trust, rooted in class and culture, would be Philby's greatest weapon. Philby's rise through MI6 during World War II was meteoric. In 1941, he was transferred to Section 5, the counterintelligence division responsible for operations against Germany and the Soviet Union in Spain and Portugal. By 1944, at age 32, he was running the entire anti-Soviet section, 9, which meant every British intelligence operation against the USSR crossed his desk before being forwarded to Moscow. The irony was exquisite. As historian Ben McIntyre noted, Philby was now responsible for gathering intelligence on Soviet espionage while simultaneously committing Soviet espionage. He was both poacher and gamekeeper, and he played both roles with consummate skill. His position gave him access to the most sensitive Allied intelligence of the war. He knew about the ultra-decrypts of German codes. He saw plans for D-Day. He read reports from British agents operating behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. All of it went to the Soviets through a careful system of dead drops and meetings with his NKVD handler. As one KGB file later revealed, Agent Stanley, Philby's codename, provided materials of such importance that they helped shape Soviet strategic planning. But Philby's real value would emerge after the war, when the alliance with the Soviet Union collapsed into Cold War. In 1946, he was appointed head of Station R, MI6's anti-Soviet operations in Turkey, a crucial listening post into the Soviet Union. In 1949, he was sent to Washington as MI6's liaison to the CIA and FBI, perhaps the most sensitive posting in British intelligence. In Washington, Philby had access to everything. He attended joint US-UK intelligence meetings. He reviewed classified reports from the nascent CIA. He learned about Operation Valuable, the joint MI6-CIA operation to infiltrate Albanian exiles back into Albania to overthrow the communist government. Within weeks of learning about the operation, Philby had informed Moscow. Every agent parachuted into Albania was either captured or killed. "They were waiting for us," one survivor later said. "They knew we were coming." Philby also learned about American and British plans to support anti-Soviet guerrilla operations in Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus. These operations, too, ended in catastrophe. Hundreds of agents, many of them former Soviet citizens who had fought against Stalin during World War II, were sent to their deaths. KGB archives later revealed that Philby's intelligence enabled the Soviets to run elaborate deception operations, feeding false intelligence back through compromised networks. But even as his betrayal claimed lives, Philby was being groomed for the top. In 1950, when the position of Deputy Chief of MI6 became vacant, Philby was considered the front-runner. His mentor, David Footman, told colleagues, "Kim will be chief within 5 years." At 38, Philby stood on the threshold of becoming the youngest head of British intelligence in history, and Moscow's most valuable asset at the apex of Western intelligence. Then, in the summer of 1951, everything began to unravel. May 25, 1951. London Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean disappeared. The two Foreign Office diplomats, both Soviet agents recruited at Cambridge in the 1930s, had fled to Moscow after MI5 began investigating Maclean. The defection shocked British intelligence, but what terrified them was the connection to Philby. Burgess had been living in Philby's Washington house just weeks before the escape. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was blunt in his message to MI6. The fact that Burgess lived with Philby and then fled to Moscow cannot be coincidental. Philby must be investigated immediately. On June 12, 1951, Philby was recalled to London and suspended from MI6. The interrogations began that summer, conducted by MI5 officers who were certain Philby was the third man who had warned Burgess and Maclean. But proving it would be nearly impossible. Philby's defense was masterful. Yes, he had known Burgess at Cambridge, but so had hundreds of others. Yes, Burgess had stayed with him in Washington, but that was a favor for an old acquaintance. No, he hadn't known about Burgess's communist sympathies or his treasonous activities. As for the suspicions, "I understand your position," Philby told his interrogators, "but I can assure you that I have always been loyal to this country." His stutter, usually mild, became more pronounced under stress, which made him seem nervous but also genuine. His answers were consistent. He never wavered. And critically, there was no hard evidence. The Venona intercepts, American decrypts of Soviet intelligence cables, hadn't yet identified him. There were suspicions, circumstantial connections, but nothing prosecutable. The interrogations continued for months. Helenas Milmo, the MI5 barrister conducting the questioning, was convinced of Philby's guilt, but couldn't break him. "I know you're a Soviet agent," Milmo told him during one session. Philby just smiled and said, "I understand why you might think that, but you're mistaken." By 1952, the official investigation concluded that while Philby's association with Burgess was imprudent, there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. He was quietly forced to resign from MI6, but not arrested. Many of his old friends rallied to his defense. Nicholas Elliott told colleagues, "I know Kim. He couldn't be a traitor. He's too English." October 23, 1955, House of Commons. The story exploded into public view when a journalist named Richard Hughes published an article identifying Philby as the third man. The scandal forced a debate in Parliament, where Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan was asked directly about Philby's status. Macmillan's answer was extraordinary. "I have no reason to conclude that Mr. Philby has at any time betrayed the interests of his country, or to identify him with the so-called third man, if indeed there was one." Philby had been cleared. He held a press conference where he denied being a communist or ever having worked for the Soviets. The stutter, the earnest manner, the old Etonian confidence, it all worked. One journalist wrote, "It's impossible to believe this stammering English gentleman could be a Soviet spy." But behind the public vindication, American intelligence remained convinced. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence who had worked closely with Philby in Washington, told colleagues, "Kim fooled me for years, but I know now. Everything we told him went straight to Moscow." The problem was proof, and Philby, now working as a journalist for The Observer and The Economist in Beirut, seemed to have escaped justice. September 1961, KGB headquarters, Moscow. The breakthrough came from Moscow. Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer, defected to the CIA in Helsinki with detailed information about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence. Golitsyn confirmed that the KGB had run a network of 5 Cambridge-educated agents in the 1930s, the Cambridge Five, and that one had been a senior MI6 officer. Separately, another piece of evidence emerged. Flora Solomon, a former friend of Philby's, who had been present during some of his Cambridge recruitment, came forward to MI5 with her suspicions. The net was closing again. January 1963, Beirut, Nicholas Elliott, now an MI6 officer specifically tasked with Soviet counterintelligence, flew to Beirut to confront his old friend. In a confrontation at a British safe house on January 12th, Elliott laid out the evidence. "The game is up, Kim," he said. "We know you worked for the Soviets. We know you betrayed us." Philby, sensing the trap, made a calculated decision. He offered a partial confession, admitting to working for the Soviets before World War II, but claiming he had broken with them afterward. It was enough to keep him from immediate arrest, but not enough to be believed. Elliott reported back to London that Philby had confessed to youthful indiscretions, but nothing more. The plan was to let Philby believe he was safe, then arrest him when more evidence could be gathered. But Philby, reading the situation correctly, knew this was his last chance. On January 23rd, he walked away from that dinner party and onto the Soviet freighter. By the time British intelligence realized he was gone, he was already in Soviet waters. The realization that Kim Philby had been a Soviet agent for 3 decades sent shockwaves through Western intelligence. The question wasn't just what he had betrayed. It was what remained uncompromised. The American response, James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief, became obsessed with the penetration. If Philby was a Soviet agent, then everything we shared with the British from 1949 to 1951 was compromised, he told colleagues. Every operation, every source, every technique. The damage assessment was catastrophic. Angleton's team identified at least 19 operations that Philby had known about and that had subsequently failed with unusual precision. Operation Valuable in Albania. Operation BG Find, the joint MI6 CIA operation to support anti-Soviet resistance in Ukraine. Multiple networks in the Baltic states. Dozens of agents dead. But Angleton went further. He began to suspect that the KGB had used Philby's intelligence to plant false information, to manipulate Western intelligence into believing things that weren't true. This paranoia, some would say justified, others would say excessive, paralyzed CIA counterintelligence for years. Angleton began to suspect everyone, investigating loyal officers, derailing careers, seeing Soviet moles everywhere. As CIA historian Thomas Powers later wrote, Philby's betrayal broke something in American counterintelligence. The trust was gone. If someone like Philby could fool everyone for so long, how could you trust anyone? The FBI, humiliated that Philby had operated under their noses in Washington, conducted its own review. J. Edgar Hoover personally reviewed all intelligence sharing with British services and imposed new restrictions. The special relationship between American and British intelligence, built during World War II, suffered serious damage. The British reckoning. In Britain, the scandal was even more devastating because it struck at the heart of the establishment. How could someone from Westminster and Cambridge, someone who had been vetted and trusted by the best people, turn out to be a traitor? Dick White, now head of MI6, conducted a comprehensive internal investigation. The findings were damning. The vetting system had been based entirely on class and connections, with virtually no security checks. As the internal report concluded, we assumed that breeding and education were sufficient guarantees of loyalty. This assumption has proven catastrophically wrong. MI6 began implementing systematic security procedures for the first time. Positive vetting, background checks, polygraph tests, all the methods that American intelligence had been using for years. The old boy network, where a word from the right person was enough to get you hired, was dismantled. But the cultural damage went deeper. MI6 had always prided itself on being a gentleman's service, where trust between colleagues was paramount. Philby's betrayal poisoned that trust. Officers began to suspect each other. Every operational failure was scrutinized for signs of betrayal. The service became paranoid, cautious, risk-averse. George Blake, another KGB mole in MI6, whose betrayal was discovered in 1961, had already damaged confidence. But Philby was different. Blake was a relatively junior officer. Philby had been destined for the top. As one MI6 officer put it, Blake was bad. But Philby could have been chief. That's what terrified us. The Soviet perspective in Moscow. The KGB celebrated Philby as their greatest asset. When he arrived in the Soviet Union in 1963, he was given the rank of colonel in the KGB, awarded the Order of Lenin, and provided with an apartment and a pension. But KGB files later revealed a more complex picture. Yes, Philby had provided invaluable intelligence, but the Soviets had also been frustrated by his handler's instructions to protect him at all costs, which sometimes meant not exploiting his intelligence fully. When Philby learned about operations to infiltrate Soviet territory, the KGB had to be careful about how they used that intelligence. If every single operation failed immediately, it would point directly to a leak in Washington or London. So the KGB ran elaborate deception operations, allowing some operations to appear to succeed initially before discovering them later. They fed false intelligence back through compromised networks to mislead Western intelligence about Soviet capabilities. Philby's intelligence didn't just protect the Soviet Union, it enabled them to manipulate what the West believed. Yuri Modin, one of Philby's KGB handlers, later wrote, "Philby's value wasn't just the secrets he passed. It was that he gave us a window into Western thinking. We understood how they analyzed information, what they considered important, what they dismissed. That understanding was often more valuable than the specific secrets." The unintended consequences. The Philby affair had ripple effects far beyond intelligence operations. It contributed to the Anglo-American intelligence crisis of the 1960s, where American agencies increasingly cut British services out of sensitive information. It accelerated the professionalization of intelligence services, moving away from the amateur gentleman tradition toward specialized training and systematic security. It also became a weapon in Soviet propaganda. The message to the West was clear. Your most trusted institutions are penetrated, your best people can be turned, your class system makes you vulnerable. For young communists and Soviet sympathizers, Philby became a hero, proof that one dedicated individual could strike at the heart of the capitalist system. July 1963, Moscow. In his first press conference in the Soviet Union, broadcast worldwide, Kim Philby confirmed what British and American intelligence had suspected for 12 years. "I worked for Soviet intelligence for 30 years. I have no regrets." The full scope of his betrayal began to emerge through defector debriefings. KGB archives opened after the Soviet collapse, and Philby's own memoir, published in 1968. The statistics were staggering. Duration of active espionage, 1934-1963, 29 years. Operations compromised, estimated at over 100. Agents betrayed, dozens, possibly hundreds. Intelligence documents passed, tens of thousands of pages, years at senior level in MI6, 1941-1951, 10 years. Years as potential future chief, 1949-1951, 2 years. But the numbers didn't capture the real damage. As CIA Director Richard Helms later testified to Congress, Philby had access to our most sensitive sources and methods during a critical period of the Cold War. The operational damage was severe, but the psychological damage, to Anglo-American intelligence cooperation, to institutional confidence, to our ability to trust our allies, was incalculable. Specific operations that failed because of Philby's intelligence became clear. Operation Valuable, 1949-1953. Every agent infiltrated into Albania to overthrow Enver Hoxha's communist government was captured or killed. At least 300 Albanian exiles died. Philby had given Moscow complete advanced knowledge of insertion points, radio frequencies, and supply routes. Baltic operations, 1949-1954. Resistance movements in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, supported by MI6 and CIA, were systematically destroyed. Former Soviet officer Pavel Sudoplatov later confirmed, "We knew everything. We had complete information from London about these operations from their inception." Volkov Affair, 1945. Konstantin Volkov, a Soviet intelligence officer in Istanbul, attempted to defect to the British, offering information about Soviet agents in British intelligence. Philby was responsible for handling the defection. He delayed the operation long enough for the NKVD to kidnap Volkov and bring him back to Moscow, where he was executed. The human cost was devastating. In a secure room in Langley, CIA officers compiled a list of names. Agents who had trusted Western intelligence, who had been promised protection, and who had died because Philby told Moscow about them. One officer who saw the list later said, "It went on for pages. These were real people with families. Philby murdered them as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself." The personal betrayals, perhaps the cruelest aspect of Philby's betrayal, was its personal dimension. Nicholas Elliott, who had defended Philby for years and considered him a close friend, never fully recovered from the revelation. When asked years later about Philby, Elliott said simply, "I had believed in him completely. That belief was misplaced. It taught me that you can never truly know anyone." James Angleton, who had socialized with Philby in Washington, who had shared drinks and secrets with him, became consumed by the betrayal. His subsequent paranoia led to the wrongful investigation of numerous innocent CIA officers and arguably damaged American counterintelligence for a generation. Philby taught me that the most dangerous enemy is the one you trust," Angleton said. Even in Moscow, Philby's life became complicated. While he was celebrated as a hero, he was also isolated, a traitor who had betrayed his class, his country, and his friends. His drinking increased. His marriages fell apart. When his Soviet handler Yuri Modin visited him in the 1980s, he found Philby disillusioned. "I sometimes wonder if it was all worth it," Philby admitted in an unguarded moment. The institutional impact, by the time the full extent of Philby's betrayal was understood in the late 1960s, it had fundamentally changed Western intelligence. The reforms implemented in response, systematic vetting, compartmentalization, need-to-know restrictions, counterintelligence investigations, became the foundation of modern intelligence security. But something else changed too. The Philby case revealed that ideology could trump class, education, and social bonds. The assumption that someone from the right background would naturally be loyal had been catastrophically wrong. As MI6 officer Patrick Seal wrote, "Philby proved that privilege and patriotism are not the same thing. A man can speak like us, dress like us, share our culture and education, and still be working to destroy us." The psychological impact rippled through the intelligence community for decades. Every major spy case that followed, Aldrich Ames at CIA, Robert Hansen at FBI, echoed elements of the Philby betrayal. The trusted insider, the long-term penetration, the difficulty of believing that one of us could be a traitor. Philby died in Moscow on May 11, 1988, at age 76, still officially a KGB colonel. The Soviet government gave him a hero's funeral. Western intelligence gave him a very different assessment. In the decades since, as Cold War archives have opened and participants have published memoirs, the full scope of the Philby case has become clearer, and in some ways more troubling. He wasn't just a spy who passed secrets. He was a systemic failure, a case study in how institutions can be blind to threats that challenge their fundamental assumptions about trust, loyalty, and identity. The Philby case revealed vulnerabilities that went beyond operational security. It showed how class systems create security risks, how gentlemen's agreements can be exploited, how institutional culture can override reasonable suspicion. British intelligence had assumed that education, breeding, and social connections guaranteed loyalty. Philby proved that assumption wrong at enormous cost. His legacy lives on in every modern counterintelligence program. The security procedures that now seem routine, background checks, polygraphs, financial investigations, psychological evaluations, were largely implemented in response to Philby and the other Cambridge spies. The principle of need to know, the compartmentalization of information, the suspicion of access, all were reactions to the reality that someone with Philby's access could betray everything. But perhaps the deepest legacy is psychological. The Philby case taught intelligence services that the enemy might not look like an enemy. He might look exactly like a friend, a colleague, someone from the same background, with the same values and the same manner of speech. That realization created a permanent suspicion at the heart of intelligence work. A recognition that trust must always be provisional, that loyalty must always be verified. As former CIA Director William Webster reflected decades later, Philby changed how we think about security. Before Philby, we thought we could tell who was trustworthy. After Philby, we realized we couldn't. That loss of certainty never fully recovered. The question that opened this story, why British intelligence had a Soviet mole for 30 years at the highest level, has a complex answer. It wasn't just Philby's skill, though he was remarkably talented. It wasn't just Soviet intelligence tradecraft, though that was sophisticated. It was that British intelligence created exactly the conditions that made such a betrayal possible. A system based on trust rather than verification, on class rather than character, on who you knew rather than what you believed. Kim Philby didn't infiltrate British intelligence despite the old boy network. He succeeded because of it. And in the shadowy world of Cold War espionage, where trust was both the most valuable commodity and the greatest vulnerability, that made all the difference.